We have over 70 countries actually voting this year. About 4 billion people are expected to vote. They do, for the most part, indicate even more uncertainty in the global economy, the geopolitical order.
You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of subjects that matter most to business leaders. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this series, and in today's conversations, we're going to discuss the 2024 elections from around the world. Joining me today is Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, the president of the Committee for Economic Development of the Conference Board. Lori, as always, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. Really pleased to be joining you for this important conversation.
So, Lori, when you start talking about elections, everybody in the U.S. will say, oh, yes, we know it's an election year in the U.S. But what we're talking about is beyond the U.S. It's also an election year for a sizable number of countries around the world. We've got nearly half of the global population voting on something this year. Talk about the scope of these elections.
Well, the scope is really broad, Steve. We have over 70 countries actually voting this year. About 4 billion people are expected to vote. Now, not all of these are democratic, obviously, but they are elections. They do, for the most part, indicate even more uncertainty in the global economy, the geopolitical order, which is front and center on the minds of business leaders. As our C-suite survey, the Conference Board C-suite survey showed, geopolitics is the number one concern, and this is just adding more disruption and more uncertainty.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the deal here, is that every time you have an election anywhere, it's subject to changing policy, whether you're talking about tax policy, regulatory policy, trade policy, just geopolitical relations, and all of that becomes shifting sands for, anybody doing business, right?
Exactly, Steve. And some of these elections are in key areas of the globe, but nonetheless, it's half the world is voting.
Yeah, and if I'm a CEO sitting, and I've got a company in the U.S. and I do business in the U.S. and it's easy for me to say, well, that stuff can happen over there. I mean, it's interesting, but it doesn't really affect me. But it does affect you because of the interrelated supply chains and the dynamics of global business today.
Yes, and this is a historic year, and that's really important to point out. We've never had this many elections happening at one time, and it's an historic year happening during an inflection point and historic transformations going on in global relations overall.
Yeah, and it's not like everything is hunky-dory around the world. I mean, we do have a couple of geopolitical conflicts going on.
Some big conflicts going on. We've got a war in the Middle East, a war in Europe, and major regional areas with an impact on global politics and the global economy. The chances of those two conflicts escalating to broader regional and even global war is pretty significant. So within this context of a pretty disrupted and uncertain world, I mean, it's much about uncertainty.
Yeah, and then you have the whole China-Taiwan situation, in which, it could be very disruptive.
Right. And that is the number in terms of areas of concern of what could happen next. Taiwan is high, probably at the top of that list.
Yeah, and that you raise the point of uncertainty, and CEOs hate uncertainty, and people go, well, yeah, but who doesn't like them? No, but the reason that they hate it is because in order to make decisions about whether to expand in an area, whether to invest in a factory or invest in operations, whether to hire more people, whether to spend money at all, you have to know what your cost of capital is, what the interest rates are going to be. You have to know where governments are friendly, and you just have to look back to what's happened over the past couple of years, where companies, have been building investments in Russia for a very long period of time. It was a hot place, one of the BRICS, where everybody should be investing, and then snap of a finger, people say, well, you've got to disinvest, and basically write off this investment. So these decisions, have have repercussions for decades and decades. So understanding the underlying shifting sands is really important.
Well, you know what's really interesting, Steve, is during COVID, one of the adjectives that was most important for CEOs is that they be empathetic. After COVID, with the two wars, with inflation, the adjective that this is CEOs self-describing themselves. The adjective that's most important is agile. That they're agile and they're resilient. And so 70 elections around the world just fits right into that need to be able to provide agility, pivot when you need to, and yeah, as you were saying, increases that uncertainty that most CEOs would prefer did not exist.
Yeah, so let's step through a few of these. As you said, some are more important than others. Let's start with the EU. They have parliamentary elections in June. Obviously, the EU is not a country. It's a group of nations. Why do they have elections at all? And what do they do? What are they electing?
So they have elections every 5 years for the EU Parliament, and it's universal voting. So it's all of Europe, all members of the EU, all citizens of the EU voting for the European Parliament. And why is it important? It's important because the EU Parliament makes decisions, is the legislative body for decisions out of the EU. And so the trends, and it's interesting to step back globally about the trends towards authoritarianism for the past 17 years have been superseding the trends towards democracy. And what you're seeing in the EU potentially is a reading of those trends and where the EU is going. And there has been a rise of authoritarianism, of the right wing, of extreme right wing in Europe. You saw this in the Netherlands elections recently. So what's going to happen in the EU? And then, of course, how does that impact the role that the EU will play economically in terms of its relations with Ukraine, or in terms of immigration decisions? And you've got Europe very disrupted right now with a major war taking place in Ukraine. How will these elections then affect unanimity of the EU in terms of how it responds to these type of crises?
Yeah, not everybody in the United States really understand what they do in Brussels, what this European Parliament does. Let's just build off of what you said. If there are more of these so-called right-wing candidates or authoritarian candidates who get into power, what actually could they change? Because you still have these sovereign nations that are members of the EU.
Right. Well, it's very similar. I think you could parallel it to the impact on NATO. NATO has to make decisions on defense decisions and military support decisions. And when you have a shift and you have countries within NATO that become more right wing, less cohesion in terms of how NATO will respond. Well, the same thing with the EU. Depending on the balance within the parliament, you have decisions, particularly mainly on the economic front, in terms of what type of support are you going to give to Ukraine economically, how the EU is going to move in terms of issues of such as a European defense arrangement, where independent of the U.S. I mean, there are major decisions that the EU handles on taxes, immigration. You go down the economic list. Trade is most important, and how will those decisions then be affected? Will it close down? Will the EU become more protectionist, or what's going to be the balance in terms of power?
Yeah, and there are a lot of migrants, displaced people, either from the Middle East situation or from the situation in Ukraine. And I don't think people understand what's happening there. And these migrants are moving into the EU countries, and there's a very open response to that at the moment. But if that was shut down, this whole notion of safety for people, safe havens, that could disappear.
Right. At least half of Ukraine, if not more, is actually displaced either internally or in terms of citizens who have left and have gone to Europe. And as you were saying, this is absolutely critical, how Europe has been open and they have been welcomed. But I mean, this places very significant burdens on the economies, on the national economies, and as well as igniting more right-wing type of responses to that immigration and how that would affect unfortunate innocent civilians of Ukraine who are victims of Putin's aggression, plus the economies of Europe.
Now, one place that is not planning to have elections this year and is not part of the EU is the UK, United Kingdom. However, UK is talking about calling elections, so they could add to the pile here. The Tories have been in charge for what, 14 years. Some are saying that they could lose power and it could switch to Labour. What could be the implications if there are elections called in the UK?
Well, the implications internally, I think, will be dramatic. I mean, there's big difference between Labour and the Tories in terms of how you deal with the British economy, and of course Britain's economy is in a bit of disarray right now, which is usually the front and center issue of most voters globally. Has to do with the economy, their lives, whether they see themselves doing better. But there could be, important changes in terms of the role of labor, private enterprise. It's significant, especially for Europe, and we've seen that in the past. I mean, we've seen that with the changes when Margaret Thatcher came in and how she dramatically changed the direction of the British economy, and also caused a tremendous amount of unrest in doing that. And so that's really up for grabs right now.
Yeah, and it's an important ally of the United States and a member of NATO. So therefore, any significant changes there could throw things, into the wind there.
Right, and first among equals in terms of allies for the U.S.
Closer to home, we have the Mexican elections are on our southern border, and clearly issues with migrants coming across that border. Looks like they're going to elect their very first female leader, as both of the candidates are women for the first time. We've got Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo, who is the former mayor of Mexico City, and then running against Senator Xochitl Galvez. What, if anything, would change depending on which of these women win the election?
Well, what's most important is, and Mexico is one country, I would actually put India in the same category, that whether it succeeds or fails, given the opportunities, this is a particularly opportunistic time for Mexico. It is really seen as the go-to place to nearshore to the U.S. It's also under the revised U.S. MCA with special trade relations with the U.S. and Canada, the North America Agreement. Whether it could actually take advantage of position it has been elevated to, given the tensions with China and trade, and China as the controlling hub of manufacturing. Really, it will be determined by how the president of Mexico, the policies they pursue. And what's really interesting is that Mexico overall tends to be much more nationalistic and favorable of protectionism.
Yeah. No, our number one trading partner is Canada, another member of the USMCA, but Mexico, for the first time, I think, in history, had a higher level of imports from Mexico than we did from China. So this is, this USMCA thing, I think, people look at it every now and then and go, okay, that's interesting. But this is real. I mean, we are an integrated trading bloc. So these Mexican priorities could, and then of course you have the migrants there, and there needs to be peace, and you've got drug issues and so forth. Do one of these candidates scare you, or is one of them more favorable or hostile to the United States?
Well, I think, as I said, I think there's something endemic in terms of how Mexico pursues its own economy. And so you're really talking about within a certain framework of protectionism where the candidates stand. Relations with Mexico, as you were saying, are so absolutely important and fundamental to the United States. We have the migrant issue. Our southern border the challenges to national security that presents, never mind the economic challenges, and how that's actually fracturing our own politics. And then, of course, the drugs and particularly fentanyl is now, top of the list there in terms of deaths that are occurring in the U.S. And so it is such a critical relationship that really warrants good relations with the Mexican president.
So whichever candidate wins, it has an accountability, a responsibility, to maintaining this great situation, and vice versa. I mean, we need to embrace and work with either one of these candidates. I underlying what you said, that's kind of where we're at, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We're talking with Dr. Lori Esposito Murray about the global elections that are happening around the world in 2024. We're going to take a short break. Be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board, joined by Lori Esposito Murray, the president of the Committee for Economic Development. And we're talking about global elections. So, Lori, let's turn to the BRICS. The so-called bloc that was a trading bloc, that's increasingly becoming more than that. Taiwan has already had their elections this year, a couple of weeks ago. What happened there, and what does this mean for Taiwan's stance with China?
So I think the Taiwan elections are extremely interesting, and I also think they're complicated or complex for China's response. You could make the case that China won. That's not how it's been reported or reviewed, but the new president of China from the Democratic Progressive Party, President Lai Ching-te, he actually lost by less than 50% of the vote. It was with 40% of the vote. That is the lowest vote margin in 20 years for a president of Taiwan. He was considered the candidate. So on the face of it, he's the candidate that China wanted least, but he actually came in with the lowest margin of support than any president before. And the party lost the parliament, so the legislative body. And so you put the two together, there were a lot of constraints on the new president and on the Democratic Progressive Party. And so they're also threatened by the rise of a new party, which is the Taiwan's People Party. So this has really made it's tempered the politics in Taiwan vis-a-vis China.
So let me make sure I've got this straight. So basically, China is very out there publicly saying that we want reunification with Taiwan. What you're saying is that the new president is still in favor of independence of Taiwan. However, the second place candidate that supports reunification, of course, it has China's view, came in very close. And so what you're saying is, rather than just being a slam dunk runaway for those who want to keep Taiwan independent, there is a growing and a building political will to give in to China, essentially. Am I overstating that?
What's interesting is that the incoming president of China, the new president of China, is actually tempered in terms of using the word independence, which is significant to what you're saying.
This is the new president of Taiwan, not China.
Of Taiwan,
right?
excuse me, of Taiwan. And so what you've seen in Taiwan was that there was, in terms of more favorable relations with China, a new party, the Taiwan's People Party, that developed, and they could not come to terms with the Kuomintang, which is the longstanding more conservative party, favorable towards calmer and better relations with China. And so that's what splintered the vote. But overall, those two parties that favored better relations with China got over 50% of the vote. They got 60% of the vote together. And so that's going to temper, and they also, the Democratic People's Party also lost control. The president's party also lost control of the parliament. So he is really constrained by how outspoken he can be about independence of Taiwan, being vitriolic towards China. He is constrained by the outcome of the vote.
Yeah, he's checked by these other candidates and their growing popularity. All right, well, turning to another brick, of course, is India. Now, India has Prime Minister Modi running for re-election for his third 5-year term. You got 1 billion people in this country who could be going to the polls. What's the likelihood that President Modi could lose, and what would happen if that was the case?
So it is pretty much accepted that President Modi will win, but it is a democracy, and the longest standing democracy, in the since independence. Saying he will absolutely win, but he is by far considered, pretty secure in winning the election. The reason why it's significant, though, is we in terms of the U.S. and democratic values, Modi is really emphasizing, and this has been a part of his platform for his 2 terms, and a Hindu nationalism, and which causes tensions, and he's really built his party on that. That's significant. It's significant if he wins a 3rd term, but even more significant, I think, as I had mentioned earlier in our discussion, is the fact that India is poised to be an economic powerhouse. And whether they do that or not depends on their own economic policies and how much they can open their economy to the investment that's now, to the investors and the investment that's out there because of this search for somewhere to go other than China. And so that is going to be extremely interesting. And I think the only country that can keep India from growing economically and becoming a real economic powerhouse is India itself. But in any case, we should expect that India's relationship with us will continue to be an important one, a strong one, with the caveat that, of course, it is going to be balancing its relationships with us, both, especially with Russia, and then with China as well.
All right, you've got 2 other BRIC countries, Russia and Iran, that are nominally going to the polls, but they're authoritarian governments in power that are not expected to be, voted out of power because, well, that's what authoritarian governments do. But there isn't really any opposition here, right? And these elections are for show only.
There is no real opposition running, which is an important distinction. And those who are running are either in jail or will be thrown in jail. But an important distinction is, and starting first with Russia, Putin really needs to have a significant number of people come out and vote. And one of his target is believed to be about 75% of the population coming out and voting. How many people vote will be really significant in terms of how it's perceived within Russia as far as his strength. So a couple of things will be watched. How many people come out and vote? And then the other key thing is how many protests will there be between now and the election itself, which is coming up soon. And how many people will he have to throw in jail because of protests, either mostly about the war. And, that just happened this past weekend. They had a number of mothers come out against the war in Ukraine, and they were all thrown in jail. Most of them were released. Almost all of them were released pretty quickly. But nonetheless, what type of tensions will and protests will develop? And then third and most importantly is, particularly in the wake of Prigozhin's coup, his march to Moscow, what will happen to the high-level positions? I mean, how necessary will Putin feel that he needs to change the higher level positions around him, whether economically or in terms of the defense ministry. And so even though it's not a contested election, it's still an important election for how he's viewed within Russia, and also the types of pressures he's under and what type of changes he'll make within his own leadership. I will just make one point, Steve, that's on just sharing a personal anecdote. I actually was part of the election observer team for Yeltsin's first election as president. And it really puts into context how much Russia has changed. And I remember talking and watching very elderly Russians standing in line for hours to vote, crying because they actually, in discussions with us, because they actually had a chance to vote for a president of Russia. And you see how far in that short a period of time, about 20 years ago, how far and how much that has deteriorated and how much Russia has changed.
Yeah, it's striking, isn't it? Another BRICS country is South Africa, and you've got the African National Congress, or the ANC party, that has governed since Nelson Mandela took charge 30 years ago. But there's uncertainty about whether the ANC keeps its majority. What are you seeing?
Well, that will be historic, obviously. The ANC, since the end of apartheid, since Nelson Mandela, has really run the country. There are a tremendous amount of economic challenges facing South Africa, a lot of discontent about just what has happened within South Africa, and disappointment that it hasn't actually been able to leverage its stature and move its country forward. And so I think that one's really going to be an interesting one to watch, and could be a dramatic, historic moment in terms of the direction of South Africa.
If the ANC loses, do you think that calls into question their participation in the BRICS?
It's not a given that they would stay in the BRICS, but I don't think that their foreign policy would necessarily change all that much, because as a potential, as an African power, it serves their interest to really play the role that India plays, where you really do balance and maintain a certain amount of independence as far as whom you support and how you maneuver that. There's a history here of both Russia, I mean, especially Russia, being seen as the all-weather friend for the end of apartheid and the South African resistance versus the U.S. And so, these are the long-standing attitudes towards the loyalty of countries in support, and it was obviously the Soviet Union, but that plays a real role. It plays a real role with India. I mean, India sees similarly the Soviet Union and Russia as its all-weather friend, whereas with the U.S. It runs hot and cold, or depending on what the policies are. So interesting dynamics. I do want to answer your question, though, about Iran, if I could, just for a minute, because it is very similar to Russia. Iran's in a very precarious situation as well, given all of the protests that have been happening over the past just a year or so ago. And even though they have quieted down, elections are still an opportunity for these authoritarian regimes to either respond somewhat in terms of their policies and their candidates. And you've seen this with Iran. I mean, it's a small, narrow spectrum, but you've seen moderation within an extremist spectrum. But it will be interesting to see what happens there, and whether sentiment of the protests are completely ignored, or whether they're somewhat responded to in terms of how that election turns out.
Yeah, and then you've got this little tiny election in the U.S. this year as well. We're not going to talk about that. It's hard to talk about it without being political, and the Conference Board and CED are nonpartisan, non-political organizations. But clearly there are issues at stake that will affect businesses depending on which party is in power, not only in the White House but also in Congress. So a lot of shifting sands, Lori, across the globe this year for businesses, and business leaders should really be paying attention and readying for it.
Well, the one thing about the US election that's really important to point out is that it is the election globally. Every country is watching to see what happens in the US and how that election turns out. And the reason why that's significant, particularly this year in 2024, is because of all of the disruption and uncertainty globally. And a lot of these solutions will be somewhat frozen as countries wait to see who is it who will actually be leading the US and what the policies will be. And so it just adds to the continuing uncertainty and the lack of solutions really being found this year. I mean, we see that all the time, usually in an election or domestically. It has tremendous implications in terms of foreign policy.
But it's a really interesting point because, you know, they say all elections are local, and there's so many Americans that just treat this as if it's, you know, I'm talking about the national elections as if it's just, you know, some little thing. But clearly the outcome of this election will impact people around the globe, and you know what these regimes around the globe are willing and able to do, and therefore, you know, the business environment at the end of the day. So business people should really be thinking about the geopolitical aspects of this election in the U.S.
Yes, definitely. And Steve, as you know, we in the Committee for Economic Development does a significant number of briefings on the Hill and in the executive branch. And I was recently doing a briefing on our 2024 business and economic priorities that our CD trustees help guide. And in that conversation with a senior staff member of a congressman who is very supportive of the supplemental for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, said that the problem is back home, that Americans within their district, it's very difficult to explain why these programs, why the support is so necessary. And that's, you know, that's coming from a congressional office where the member really understands this geopolitical significance and still grapples with trying to inform his constituents as to the reasons why he sees that as so very important.
Yeah, and this is a role that business leaders should play: is not to take a partisan view, not to, you know, but to inform and make people understand the stakes that this election has on everyone on the globe. So
exactly.
Dr. Lori Esposito Murray, thanks for being with us today.
No, thank you, Steve. Important conversation.
And thanks to all of you for listening into CEO Perspectives. Every week I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in geopolitics, economics, public policy, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, your friends, your relatives, everybody who cares about what's going on in this world. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.